Sometimes the hardest part of losing someone isn't the goodbye. It's learning how to live in a world where they're just gone. Clay Whitman knew that pain better than most. His wife Linda died 3 years ago, and his son Ben left soon after, unable to bear the memories. Now Clay worked his family farm alone, the same land his grandfather had cleared by hand. One morning, while breaking up an old rock near a twisted oak tree, his pickaxe struck something hollow. Beneath the stone lay a hidden chamber that had been sealed for over 100 years. Inside were things that would change everything, not just for Clay, but for his entire town. What he discovered would finally bring his son home. But could it heal the distance between them? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock rang at 5:30, same as it had every morning for the past 30 years. Clay Whitman's hand found the button in the dark, silencing the bell before his eyes were fully open. The house was quiet, too quiet. It had been that way for 3 years now, ever since Linda passed. He sat on the edge of the bed, feet finding the worn floorboards, and allowed himself a moment before the day began. The bedroom still held traces of her. The quilt she'd made draped across the foot of the bed, her reading glasses on the nightstand, where she'd left them the last time she'd been well enough to read. Clay had never moved them. Some mornings, he could almost convince himself she was just downstairs making coffee, humming one of those old hymns she loved. But the silence always reminded him otherwise. Clay dressed in the half-light of dawn, flannel shirt, work jeans, boots that had been resoled twice. In the bathroom mirror, a 54-year-old man looked back at him with tired eyes. His hair had gone mostly grey in the last few years, and the lines around his mouth had deepened. Linda used to say he had kind eyes. He wondered if that was still true, or if grief had changed them too. Downstairs, he made coffee in the old percolator, the sound of it bubbling, filling the kitchen with something close to comfort. He stood at the window, watching the sun rise over the 200 acres that had been in his family for 5 generations. The land rolled gently toward the tree line, fields that would need plowing soon, fences that needed mending. Always something that needed fixing. The Whitman farm sat in the hills of rural Pennsylvania, just outside the small town of Millridge. Population 1,847, though that number had been declining for years. Most of the young people left for the cities, looking for work that didn't leave dirt under their fingernails. Clay couldn't blame them. Farming was hard work, with little reward these days. Some months he barely broke even, but this land was in his blood. His grandfather had cleared it with an axe and a mule. His father had worked it through the Depression, somehow keeping the family fed when neighbors were losing everything. Clay had learned to drive a tractor before he could ride a bike. This place was part of him, and he was part of it. Linda had understood that. She'd grown up in town, the daughter of a school teacher, but she'd taken to farm life like she was born to it. She'd kept a garden that was the envy of the county, put up preserves every fall, and made their small farmhouse into a home that always smelled like fresh bread and wood smoke. She'd been the heart of this place. When she got sick, it happened fast. 6 months from diagnosis to the end. Pancreatic cancer, the doctor said, already too far along to treat effectively. They'd tried anyway. Surgery, chemotherapy that made her so weak she could barely stand. Clay had held her hand through all of it, watched her shrink down to nothing, seen the light in her eyes dim a little more each day. Ben had been 25 then, working construction in Pittsburgh, trying to make his own way. He'd come home when they called, stayed for the final weeks. Those had been the hardest days of Clay's life, watching his wife die while his son sat, silent and hollow-eyed in the corner, unable to process what was happening. After the funeral, Ben had stayed for 2 weeks. They'd worked the farm together, not talking much, just moving through the motions. But Clay could feel his son pulling away, grief building a wall between them. One morning, he'd come downstairs to find Ben's truck gone and a note on the table. "I'm sorry, Dad. I can't stay here right now. Everything reminds me of her." That had been nearly 3 years ago. They'd talked on the phone maybe a dozen times since then. Awkward conversations where neither of them said what they really meant. Clay would ask how work was going. Ben would say fine. Ben would ask about the farm. Clay would say he was managing. Then silence would stretch between them until one of them found an excuse to hang up. Clay poured his coffee and took it out to the porch. The April morning was cool, the air fresh with the smell of earth and growing things. This was his favorite time of day before the work began, when he could just sit and watch the world wake up. His gaze drifted to the old oak tree at the eastern edge of the near field. It was a massive thing, probably 200 years old, with a trunk so wide it would take 3 men to circle it with their arms. What made it remarkable, though, was the boulder it grew through. A huge split stone, maybe 10 feet across, with the oak's trunk rising right through the middle where the 2 halves of rock had separated. Local kids used to say the tree had broken the stone, but Clay's grandfather had told him the truth. The boulder had been split by ice ages ago, and an acorn had fallen in the crack. Over decades, the tree had simply grown around what was in its way. Linda had loved that tree. She'd painted it, photographed it in every season, written a little history of it for the County Historical Society. She'd called it a testament to persistence, to life finding a way even in the hardest circumstances. Clay had been meaning to clear the brush around it for months now. The wild roses and brambles had grown up thick, making it hard to get close to the trunk. He'd finally decided this morning was the day. He finished his coffee, set the cup on the porch rail, and headed to the shed for his tools. The work was harder than he'd expected. The roots of the brambles ran deep, and the old rose canes caught at his gloves and jacket. He worked methodically, cutting and pulling, stacking the debris in a pile to burn later. Sweat soaked through his shirt, despite the cool morning. He was working near the base of the boulder, trying to pry out a particularly stubborn root, when his pickaxe hit stone with a sound that wasn't quite right. Not the solid thunk of tool meeting rock, but something more hollow, something that rang. Clay stopped, wiped his forehead with his sleeve, and knelt down. He cleared away more dirt and debris, exposing the base of the boulder. There, between the 2 halves of the split stone, where the oak's roots had pushed them slightly apart, was a gap. Not natural, too regular, too deliberate. His heart began to beat a little faster. He worked more carefully now, using his hands to clear away the accumulated soil and dead leaves. The gap was wider than he'd thought, maybe 18 inches, and behind it, darkness. The ground sloped down, away from the light. Clay sat back on his heels, breathing hard. In all his years working this land, he'd never noticed this, but then the brush had been thick here for as long as he could remember. Linda had wanted to clear it, make the tree more accessible, but there'd always been other things to do, more urgent things. He reached into the opening, felt cool air moving against his hand. There was space back there, real space. His fingers touched something metal, and he pulled back instinctively. Then, gathering his courage, he reached in again and closed his hand around it. When he pulled it out into the light, he found himself holding an old iron key, heavy and rust-pitted, the kind that might open a door in a castle or an ancient church. Clay turned it over in his hands, his mind racing. What was this? Why was it here? And what did it open? The sun was higher now, warming his back. He should get to the other chores, the things that needed doing, but he couldn't stop staring at the key, couldn't stop thinking about that darkness beyond the stone, the space that shouldn't exist. He tucked the key into his pocket and stood, brushing the dirt from his knees. Tonight, after the day's work was done, he would come back with a flashlight. He would see what was there. But standing there in the morning light, with the weight of iron in his pocket and questions multiplying in his mind, Clay Whitman felt something he hadn't felt in 3 long years. He felt curious. He felt awake. For the first time since Linda died, he felt like something was about to begin. Clay couldn't focus on his work. All day, as he repaired fence posts and checked on the early plantings, his hand kept drifting to his pocket, fingers closing around the iron key. By 3 in the afternoon, he gave up pretending he could concentrate on anything else. He went to the barn and gathered proper tools, a heavy-duty flashlight, a crowbar, work gloves, and a coil of rope. He felt slightly foolish, like a boy playing at adventure, but something in his gut told him this was important. This was real. The sun was still high when he returned to the oak tree. In the daylight, the opening seemed less mysterious, just a gap between stones. But when he knelt and shone his flashlight into the darkness, his breath caught. Stone steps, carefully carved, descending into the earth. Clay's hands trembled slightly as he cleared more debris from the opening. The gap was just wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he turned sideways. He tested the first step with his boot, solid, stable. The stone was dry, which seemed impossible for something that had been buried for who knew how long. He took a breath and eased himself through the opening. The stairs went down about 12 feet, ending in a small chamber. Clay swept the flashlight beam around, and his mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. The room was perhaps 15 feet square, with a ceiling just tall enough for him to stand upright. The walls were made of fitted stone, the workmanship careful and deliberate. This wasn't a natural cave. Someone had built this. The air was cool but not damp, surprisingly fresh. There must be ventilation somewhere, though he couldn't immediately see it. Along one wall stood a wooden workbench, and on it sat an old oil lantern, a few simple tools, and something wrapped in oilcloth. Clay approached the bench carefully, half afraid the whole thing might crumble at his touch. But when he picked up the oilcloth bundle, it was solid, preserved by the dry air and careful wrapping. His fingers worked at the ties, stiff with age, until they finally came loose. Inside was a book, a journal bound in leather that had once been brown but had faded to a mottled gray. No title on the cover, just a simple brass clasp holding it shut. Clay opened it with shaking hands. The first page bore a date, April 3rd, 1858. Below it, in careful script, "This record I keep in faith that what we do here matters, though we work in darkness and in secret. May God grant that future eyes which read these words live in a time when such work is no longer needed." Nathaniel Cross. Clay's knees went weak. He sat down hard on an old wooden chair, barely noticing its creak of protest. Nathaniel Cross. That was the name on the original deed to this property, the first Whitman ancestor to own this land. At least that's what the family had always believed. But the dates didn't match what Clay had been told. Nathaniel was supposed to have arrived here in the 1840s, established the farm, and then sold it to Clay's great-great-grandfather William in 1865. But this journal said 1858, and Nathaniel was writing about working in secret. Clay turned the page, his eyes racing over the entries. April 15th, 1858. 3 souls arrived last night, a mother and 2 young children. The husband was sold south 6 months ago. She has nothing but hope and the clothes they wear. We gave them food, fresh garments, and a safe place to rest. Tomorrow night, when the moon is down, Samuel will take them north to the next station. May 2nd, 1858. A close call. Riders came through asking questions. I told them I'd seen nothing, which is true in the way that matters. I saw nothing I intend to speak of. They didn't search, thank Providence. The family of 4 hidden below never made a sound. June 10th, 1858. Sometimes I wonder at the darkness in men's hearts, that they would claim ownership of another soul. But then I see the light in the eyes of those we help, the way a mother holds her children knowing they have a chance at freedom. And I know this work is holy. Whatever the cost, it is worth paying. Clay's hands were shaking so hard he had to set the journal down. His farm, his family's land, had been a station on the Underground Railroad. Right here in this chamber beneath the oak tree, people fleeing slavery had found shelter. And Nathaniel Cross hadn't been just a farmer. He'd been part of something dangerous, something noble, something that mattered more than profit or safety. He picked up the journal again, turning pages carefully. Entry after entry documented the people who had passed through. Their names, their stories, where they'd come from, where they hoped to go. Some entries were brief, just noting that people had arrived and been sent on. Others were longer, more personal. Nathaniel wrote about a young man who played the fiddle and filled the chamber with music, about an elderly woman who prayed over him with tears running down her face, about children who laughed despite everything they'd survived. The last entry was dated November 4th, 1863. The war continues, but the cause is just and victory will come. This station has served its purpose well. By my count, 247 souls have found safety here over these 5 years. That number represents families, futures, the continuation of hope in dark times. The chamber will remain sealed and secret until such time as the world has changed enough that this history can be told without danger. To whoever finds this, you stand on ground made sacred by the courage of those who passed through. Honor their memory. Continue their work in whatever form your time requires. The struggle for human dignity is never finished. Clay sat in the silence of the underground chamber, surrounded by history he'd never known existed. His land meant more than he'd understood. His family's story was more complicated, more meaningful than the simple narrative he'd been told. And in that moment, sitting in the darkness with only his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, Clay knew exactly what he had to do. He had to call Ben. His son needed to know about this, needed to understand that this place, this land, that had driven them apart with its memories and its demands, was part of something larger than their grief. This wasn't just a farm. It was a place where people had risked everything to do what was right. Clay climbed the stone steps, emerged into the late afternoon light, and pulled out his phone. His finger hovered over Ben's name in his contacts. They hadn't spoken in 8 months. The last conversation had been stilted, painful, ending with an awkward goodbye and a promise to talk soon that neither of them had kept. But this was bigger than their discomfort. This was history. This was family. This was important. Clay pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear. It rang 3 times before Ben answered, his voice cautious. "Dad?" "Ben," Clay said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "Son, I need you to come home. I've found something you need to see." The 3 days between the phone call and Ben's arrival felt longer than the 3 years since Linda's funeral. Clay spent every spare moment in the chamber, cataloging what he found, taking photographs with his phone, handling each artifact with the reverence it deserved. He found more than just the journal. In a wooden chest along the far wall, wrapped carefully in layers of old cloth, was a quilt. Even folded, Clay could see the patterns, squares and triangles in deep blues and browns, arranged in designs that seemed both random and deliberate. He remembered Linda talking about quilts like this, how the patterns had meanings, how they'd been used to send messages along the Underground Railroad. Linda would have loved this discovery. The thought hit him with unexpected force, and he had to sit down for a moment, pressing his palms against his eyes. She'd been the historian in their family, the one who pored over old county records and family Bibles, who dragged him to historical society meetings and preservation fundraisers. He'd gone along to make her happy, never understanding why the past mattered so much to her. Now, sitting in a room that had hidden its secrets for over a century and a half, he understood. The past wasn't dead. It was right here, reaching forward, touching the present, shaping what came next. He'd spent the last 3 years trying to maintain everything exactly as Linda had left it, as if preservation could somehow keep her close. But that wasn't what she would have wanted. She'd always been looking forward, finding connections between what was and what could be. This discovery, she would have seen it as a beginning, not an ending. Clay carefully unfolded the quilt, spreading it across the workbench. The stitching was fine, the fabric worn but intact. He photographed it from every angle, then looked up the patterns on his phone. Bear paw, a signal for mountain passes to follow. Flying geese, a directional marker pointing north. Crossroads, a symbol for Cleveland, a major hub on the Underground Railroad. This wasn't just a quilt. It was a map, instructions sewn into cloth so they could be hidden in plain sight. On the morning Ben was due to arrive, Clay cleaned the farmhouse. He hadn't realized how much he'd let things slide until he started looking at the place through someone else's eyes. Dishes stacked in the sink, dust thick on the furniture, newspapers piled by the door. He'd been living like a ghost, moving through rooms without really inhabiting them. He washed and swept and put things away, opened windows to let fresh air chase out the staleness. By the time he heard a vehicle coming up the drive, the house looked almost like itself again. Ben's truck was dusty, the bed loaded with tools and equipment from whatever job he'd been working. Clay stepped out onto the porch as his son climbed down from the cab, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Ben had changed. He was 28 now, but he looked older, harder around the edges, with a tiredness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. His dark hair needed cutting, and his work clothes were stained with paint and plaster dust. But he was still Ben, still Clay's son. "Hey, Dad," Ben said, his voice careful, neutral. "Hey yourself," Clay replied. "How was the drive?" "Fine. Traffic wasn't bad." Ben grabbed a duffel bag from the truck bed. "So what's this all about? You were pretty mysterious on the phone." Clay smiled slightly. "I figured if I told you over the phone, you wouldn't believe me. Come on, I'll show you." They walked across the field toward the oak tree, and Clay felt the awkwardness between them like a physical presence. Ben kept a careful distance, hands in his pockets, gaze on the horizon. They'd once been comfortable together, father and son working side by side, talking about everything and nothing. Now they were strangers making small talk. "Farm looks good," Ben offered. "It's holding together," Clay said. "Barely. You keeping up with everything okay?" "I manage." Silence fell again, heavy and uncomfortable. Clay cleared his throat. "I'm glad you came. You said it was important." "It is." They'd reached the oak tree. Clay gestured toward the opening between the stones. "It's down there. I found it by accident, clearing brush. Been here all along, and I never knew." Ben frowned, stepping closer. "What is it, a cave?" "Not exactly." "Here," Clay handed him a flashlight. "See for yourself." Ben squeezed through the opening, and Clay followed him down. At the bottom of the steps, Ben stopped, his flashlight beam sweeping the chamber. Clay watched his son's face in the reflected light, saw the confusion shift to wonder. "What is this place?" Ben breathed. "Underground railroad station," Clay said quietly. "Our land. Our family. This is where they hid people escaping slavery over 150 years ago." Ben turned slowly, taking it all in. His beam found the workbench, the journal, the carefully folded quilt. "You're serious. Dead serious. There's a journal. Written by Nathaniel Cross, the first owner of this property. He documented everyone who came through. 247 people, Ben, right here under this tree." Ben moved to the workbench, picked up the journal with careful hands. He opened it, read the first page, then looked up at his father with something like awe in his eyes. "This is real. This is actually real. Every word. I've been down here for 3 days, going through everything. There's more. This quilt, it's got patterns that are coded messages. And look," Clay pointed to faint scratches on the stone walls. "Those marks, I think they're from the people who stayed here. Names, dates, maybe prayers." For the first time since he'd arrived, Ben's careful distance crumbled. He crossed to the wall, running his fingers over the markings. "Dad, this is incredible. Do you have any idea how important this is?" "I'm starting to," Clay said. "That's why I called you. I needed you to see it. This place, this land, it's not just ours. It's part of something bigger, something that mattered." Ben turned to face him, and in his eyes Clay saw the boy he'd been before grief had changed him. "Mom would have gone crazy over this. She'd have been down here with her camera and her notebooks, documenting every detail." "I know," Clay said softly. "I've been thinking about her a lot the last few days, wishing she could see this." The moment stretched between them, the first honest acknowledgement of Linda's absence they'd shared since the funeral. Ben's throat worked and he looked away. "Yeah, me too." They spent the next hour exploring the chamber together. Ben photographed everything with his phone, asked questions Clay couldn't always answer, marveled at the craftsmanship of the hidden room. The awkwardness between them didn't disappear, but it eased slightly, pushed aside by shared wonder. "What are you going to do?" Ben asked finally. "You have to tell someone about this, right? Historians, maybe the county museum?" "I already called Dr. Iris Pemberton at the Historical Society. She's coming tomorrow to verify everything." "But Ben," Clay paused, "I wanted you here first." "Your family. You should be part of this." Ben met his eyes, and something complicated passed across his face. "I'm only here for a few days, Dad. I've got to get back to work." "I know, but stay through the weekend? Help me figure out what to do with all this." Ben hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, okay, through the weekend." It wasn't much. It wasn't the healing Clay had hoped for, but it was a start. Dr. Iris Pemberton arrived precisely at 9 the next morning, driving a sensible sedan that had seen better days. She was in her early 60s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. Clay had met her a few times at the historical society events Linda used to drag him to, and he remembered her as sharp-minded and no-nonsense. She shook hands with both Clay and Ben on the porch, her grip firm. "Mr. Whitman, thank you for calling me. I'll confess I barely slept last night thinking about what you described." "Wait until you see it," Ben said, and Clay heard genuine excitement in his son's voice. It had been a long time since he'd heard Ben excited about anything. They led her to the oak tree and down into the chamber. Dr. Pemberton moved carefully, her flashlight beam methodical as she examined every surface. She said nothing for several minutes, just looked and occasionally made notes in a small leather notebook she'd pulled from her bag. Finally, she turned to Clay. "Do you have any idea what you've found here?" "A piece of history," Clay offered. "More than that. This is a remarkably well-preserved underground railroad station. Most of the ones we know about have been destroyed or significantly altered over time. But this," she gestured around the chamber, "this is nearly pristine. The dry conditions, the sealed entrance, the lack of disturbance. Mr. Whitman, this is a major historical discovery." Ben glanced at Clay, something like pride flickering across his face. Clay felt a strange warmth in his chest. When was the last time his son had looked at him that way? Dr. Pemberton spent the next 2 hours examining everything in detail. She photographed the journal, handling it with cotton gloves she'd brought. She studied the quilt, identifying patterns Clay hadn't noticed. And then, while carefully examining the workbench, she found something none of them had seen. "There's a false bottom in this drawer," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Clay and Ben crowded close as she worked a small knife around the edges of what they'd thought was a solid drawer bottom. With a soft click it came free, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was another book, smaller than the journal. Dr. Pemberton lifted it out with careful hands and opened it. Her eyes widened. "It's a ledger, a record of names." She set it on the workbench where they could all see. Page after page of names, written in the same careful script as the journal. But these entries were different, just names, dates, and brief notations. "Arrived July 12th, 1858. Mother, father, 3 children. Sent north July 14th. Single man, August 3, 1859, injured foot. Remained 9 days. How many?" Clay asked quietly. Dr. Pemberton turned pages, counting silently. "Over 200 entries. Each one represents at least one person, sometimes whole families." She looked up at them, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Each one of these names is someone who risked everything for freedom. Someone Nathaniel Cross risked his life to protect." Ben leaned over the ledger, his finger tracing down the columns. "Look at this one. Young girl, maybe 8 years. Traveled alone. Spoke no English. Drew pictures to communicate. God, she was just a kid." "They often were," Dr. Pemberton said gently. "Families would send children north when they could, hoping they'd be safer. It doesn't bear thinking about too closely what these people endured." They worked together for the rest of the morning, Dr. Pemberton guiding them through proper documentation procedures. She explained what needed to be done: academic verification, carbon dating of the materials, cross-referencing the names with other Underground Railroad records, securing the site to prevent damage or theft. "This will take time," she said. "Months, possibly years, to fully research and authenticate everything. But I can tell you right now, this is legitimate. The writing style matches the period. The materials are consistent with mid-19th century construction. And the historical details in the journal align with what we know about Underground Railroad operations in this region." "What happens now?" Clay asked. "That's partly up to you. This is your property, so you have some say in how this proceeds. But I'd strongly recommend we bring in the State Historical Preservation Office, possibly apply for landmark status. There may be grant funding available for preservation and interpretation. Clay felt suddenly overwhelmed. I just wanted to understand what I'd found. I didn't think about it becoming this big. Dr. Pemberton smiled kindly. History has a way of being bigger than we expect, Mr. Whitman, but you don't have to do this alone. The Historical Society will help. I'll help. After Dr. Pemberton left, promising to return with colleagues and proper equipment, Clay and Ben walked back to the house in silence. Clay's mind was spinning with everything she'd said. Landmark status, preservation funding, academic studies. It was all so far beyond what he'd imagined. "You okay?" Ben asked as they reached the porch. "Honestly, I'm not sure. This is a lot." "Yeah?" Ben sat down on the porch steps, and after a moment Clay joined him. They sat side by side, looking out over the land that suddenly meant so much more than it had a week ago. "Can I ask you something?" Ben said after a while. "Of course. Why did you really call me?" "I mean, yeah, this is important. But you could have handled this with Dr. Pemberton. You didn't need me here." Clay was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I did need you here. Your family, Ben. This is your history, too." And he paused, struggling. "I've missed you. I know things have been hard between us. I know I haven't been the father you needed after your mother died. But when I found out what this place really means, I thought maybe it was a chance. A chance for us to what?" Ben's voice was gentle but guarded. "To be in the same place again, working on something that matters." "I don't know. Maybe that's foolish." Ben was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I left because everything here reminded me of her. The kitchen where she cooked, the garden she planted, her chair in the living room. I couldn't walk through this house without seeing her everywhere, and it hurt too much." "I know," Clay said. "I felt the same way. Still do some days. But you stayed. I didn't know where else to go. This land, it's all I know how to do. And leaving felt like abandoning her somehow, even though I know that doesn't make sense." Ben nodded slowly. "I've been miserable in Pittsburgh. The work's fine, but it's just work. No meaning to it. No connection. I've been drifting, Dad, just getting by day to day, not really living. That makes two of us." Then they sat with that admission hanging between them, both of them acknowledging what they'd been avoiding for 3 years. They'd both been lost, both been surviving rather than living. "This discovery," Ben said eventually, "it's important, not just historically. I don't know. It feels like maybe there's a reason you found it now." "What do you mean?" "Mom loved this kind of thing. Local history, stories about real people doing courageous things. And this place, this chamber, it's about people who were separated from their families, trying to find their way back together, trying to be free." Ben turned to look at Clay. "Maybe that's what we need to do. Find our way back to each other." Clay felt his throat tighten. "I'd like that, son. I really would." "Then let's do it. Let's figure this out together. Not just the historical stuff, but us. We can't keep going the way we have been." "No," Clay agreed. "We can't." It wasn't a solution. It wasn't instant healing, but it was honest, and it was a beginning. For the first time in 3 years, Clay felt something like hope. The days settled into a rhythm. Mornings, Clay and Ben worked the farm together, the regular work that still needed doing regardless of what lay beneath the oak tree. Afternoons, they made the drive into Millridge to the Historical Society, where Dr. Pemberton had given them access to the archives. Clay had never spent much time in the basement of the old courthouse building where the Historical Society kept its records. Linda had volunteered here for years, cataloging documents and organizing photographs, but he'd rarely joined her. Now, sitting at one of the long tables with Ben beside him, surrounded by boxes of old papers and leather-bound volumes, he felt closer to her than he had in months. "Look at this," Ben said one afternoon, sliding a book across the table. It was a county history published in 1889, its pages brittle with age. He'd marked a section with his finger. "There's a mention of Nathaniel Cross." Clay leaned over to read. "Among the early settlers of Millridge Township was Nathaniel Cross. a man of Quaker faith who established a prosperous farm on the Eastern Ridge in 1855. Known for his quiet demeanor and charitable works, Cross was regarded as a pillar of the community until his death in 1868. He never married, and upon his passing, the property transferred to William Cross, believed to be a distant relative who had come to assist in the farm's operation during Cross's final years. William Cross, Clay said quietly. That's my great-great-grandfather. At least that's what I always thought. But it says believed to be a distant relative, Ben pointed out. Not confirmed. And why would Nathaniel leave the farm to a distant relative instead of closer family? Dr. Pemberton appeared beside them, reading over their shoulders. That's an excellent question. And I may have found part of the answer. She set down a folder she'd been carrying. I've been going through birth and death records. There's no record of Nathaniel Cross marrying or fathering any children, at least not officially. But I did find something interesting. She opened the folder and pulled out a photocopy of an old document. This is from the Quaker meeting records. It notes that in 1843, a young woman named Ruth Brenner died in childbirth. The child, a boy, survived and was taken in by her family. No father is listed. That's not uncommon for the time, Clay said, especially if the mother was unmarried. True. But here's what's interesting. Ruth Brenner's family lived on the property adjacent to where Nathaniel Cross would later establish his farm. And 15 years later, when her younger brother sold that property and moved west, Nathaniel Cross purchased it, extending his holdings. Ben frowned. You think Nathaniel was the father? I think it's possible. More than possible. Dr. Pemberton pulled out another document. This is William Cross's baptism record from 1843. It lists the Brenner family as his guardians. But there's a notation in the margin, barely legible. But I had a colleague with better eyes than mine look at it. It says CNC provision. Nathaniel Cross, Clay breathed. I believe so. I think Nathaniel had a relationship with Ruth Brenner. She died giving birth to their son, and he made provisions for the boy's care while keeping his own involvement quiet. Perhaps to protect the child from scandal, perhaps because of his Quaker beliefs about responsibility. Either way, he kept watch over William from a distance, and eventually the boy came to work the farm with him. Clay sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. If this was true, then William Cross hadn't been a distant relative at all. He'd been Nathaniel's son, which meant we're directly descended from Nathaniel Cross, Ben said, voicing what Clay was thinking. This land, the work he did here, it's not just our property. It's our bloodline. That evening, they drove back to the farm in thoughtful silence. Clay kept turning the discovery over in his mind, trying to reconcile this new understanding with the family history he'd always believed. Everything felt different now, as if the ground beneath him had shifted slightly but fundamentally. We should go back down, Ben said as they pulled up to the house. Look through everything again, knowing what we know now. They took fresh batteries for the flashlights and descended into the chamber. It felt different this time, more personal. Clay moved along the walls, examining them more carefully than he had before. And there, in the far corner, he found what he hadn't noticed in his earlier explorations, carved into the stone. The letters worn but still visible, N.C. Pas R.B. 1842, his ancestors' private memorial, hidden where no one would see it. A record of love that had to remain secret, grief that couldn't be openly expressed. Dad, come look at this, Ben called from the workbench. Clay crossed to where his son stood holding something small, a tin case about the size of a pocket watch. Ben opened it carefully, revealing what was inside, a daguerreotype. The image was faded, but still clear enough to make out the figures. A man, standing stiffly formal in dark clothing, his hand resting on the shoulder of a woman seated before him. Around them, 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all dressed in their finest clothes. All of them looking directly at the camera with expressions that were hard to read. Not quite smiling, but not afraid either. Determined, maybe, hopeful. Turn it over, Clay said. On the back, written in faded ink, July 1859, safe passage granted. By the grace of God. They were looking at people Nathaniel had helped. A family that had passed through this chamber, had hidden in this darkness, had taken the risk of freedom. The photograph would have been taken after they'd reached safety. A record of survival, of victory against terrible odds. They made it, Ben said softly. Whoever they were, wherever they were going, they made it. Clay studied the man's face, the way he held his hand protectively on his wife's shoulder, the way she held the youngest child against her chest. These weren't abstract historical figures. They were real people who had lived and hoped and been terrified and brave. And his ancestor, his great-great-great-grandfather, had been part of their story. There are drawings on the wall, Ben said, moving his flashlight beam along the stone. I noticed them before, but I thought they were just marks. Look, they're pictures. Clay followed the beam. Scratched into the stone, almost invisible unless you knew to look for them, were simple images. A house, a sun, birds in flight, and words carved carefully in a child's uncertain hand. Thank you. The chamber suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. These walls had witnessed so much courage, so much fear, so much hope. Children had hidden here, drawing pictures while they waited to learn if they'd live to see another day. Families had huddled in this darkness, trusting strangers with their lives, and Nathaniel Cross, his ancestor, had given them that chance. Not for money, not for recognition, because it was right, because some things mattered more than safety. Clay felt the weight of that legacy settling onto his shoulders. This land wasn't just dirt and crops and property lines. It was sacred ground, made holy by the courage of everyone who had passed through it. We have to do something with this, Ben said, still staring at the children's drawings. We can't just keep it to ourselves. I know, Clay said. But what? A museum exhibit? That doesn't feel like enough. No, Ben agreed. It needs to be more. Something that honors what happened here. Something that continues it somehow. They stood in the quiet chamber, each thinking about what that might mean. Above them, the oak tree's roots pushed through stone, persistent and strong. Life finding a way, even in the hardest circumstances, just like Linda used to say. Ben was the one who found the gold. They'd been measuring the chamber for documentation purposes, creating a detailed map of the space at Dr. Pemberton's request. Ben was working along the far wall, running his tape measure from corner to corner, when he noticed something odd about the stone. "Dad, hand me that crowbar." Clay passed it over, watching as Ben wedged the tool into what looked like a naturally occurring gap in the masonry. But when he applied pressure, a section of stone shifted, not crumbling, but moving as a unit. "It's a false panel," Ben said, his voice rising with excitement. He worked carefully, prying the stone loose. Behind it was a small cavity, and inside that, a metal box about the size of a shoebox. Clay's hands shook as they lifted it out together. The box was heavy, sealed with wax that had gone brittle with age. Ben used his pocket knife to break the seal, then carefully opened the lid. Gold coins, 23 of them, gleaming dully in the flashlight beam. Each one was stamped with the image of Lady Liberty and dated between 1857 and 1860. Tucked beside the coins was a piece of paper, folded and yellowed. Clay unfolded it with careful fingers and read aloud, "For those who continue the work, should I fall." This gold was given by friends of the cause to fund safe passage and new beginnings. I've needed little of it. Providence has provided. Let it serve future need in the ongoing struggle for human dignity and freedom. Use it wisely. Use it well. N.C., March 1863. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the discovery settling over them. Finally, Ben spoke. "How much do you think it's worth?" "I don't know. Maybe 50,000? More if they're rare dates." Clay carefully set the note back in the box. "It belongs in a museum, with the rest of the artifacts." "Does it?" Ben's tone was careful, not argumentative, but questioning. "Nathaniel says it's for those who continue the work. He meant it to be used, not displayed. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we think about what continuing the work means. Maybe it means donating to organizations that help refugees or support civil rights causes. Or," Ben hesitated, "or maybe it means keeping this place going, this farm, making sure it can continue to mean something. Clay felt a knot forming in his stomach. "Ben, I need to tell you something." His son looked at him, waiting. "The farm is in trouble. Bad trouble. I'm 6 months behind on the mortgage. The bank's been sending notices. I've been trying to catch up, but—" He shook his head. "The truth is, I'm probably going to lose this place." Ben's face went through several expressions: surprise, concern, and then something that looked like anger. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ask for help? What help could you give? You're barely making ends meet yourself. I didn't want to burden you with my problems. Dad, I've been sending money." Now it was Clay's turn to be surprised. "What?" "Every month, whatever I could spare. I've been sending it to Aunt Diane. She said she'd make sure it helped with the bills." Ben's voice was tight. "I thought you knew. I thought you were too proud to acknowledge it." Clay felt like he'd been punched. Linda's sister Diane had been helping him with paperwork after Linda died, dealing with insurance claims and medical bills. She'd never mentioned that Ben was sending money. She must have been using it to quietly pay down some of the smaller bills, the utility payments and such, keeping the farm running without either man knowing the other was trying to help. "I didn't know," Clay said quietly. "Son, I had no idea." They stared at each other across the small chamber, both realizing how thoroughly they'd failed to communicate, how their efforts to protect each other had actually just built walls between them. "This is exactly what I mean," Ben said, his voice rough. "We've been doing this for 3 years. Both of us hurting, both of us alone, both of us too stubborn or too scared to reach out. And the whole time, we could have been helping each other." "You're right," Clay admitted. "You're absolutely right." Ben looked down at the box of gold coins. "So maybe this is how we change that. Maybe this is how we start actually working together instead of just existing in the same family. What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we use some of this to save the farm. Not all of it. We'll donate most of it to causes Nathaniel would have approved of. But enough to get you caught up on payments, to give us breathing room." Ben met his father's eyes. "And then I'm proposing I move back home, permanently, help you run this place." Clay's throat tightened. "You have a life in Pittsburgh. I have a job in Pittsburgh. That's not the same as a life. I've been miserable there, Dad, lonely, going through the motions. Coming back here, working on this project with you, it's the first time in 3 years I felt like I was doing something that mattered." "Ben, let me finish. I know we've got a lot to work through. I know it won't be easy, living in the same house, working together every day. We'll probably drive each other crazy sometimes, but I want to try. I want to be here. I want to help figure out what to do with this discovery, with Nathaniel's legacy. And honestly, I want to stop running from Mom's memory. She loved this place. Maybe being here doing this work is a way to honor her." Clay couldn't speak. He just nodded, not trusting his voice. "But we do this right," Ben continued. "We talk to Dr. Pemberton. We talk to a lawyer about the coins and what's legal and ethical. We make a plan for the farm that isn't just survival, but actually building something. And we're honest with each other. No more protecting each other by staying silent." "Deal. Deal," Clay managed. They climbed out of the chamber into the late afternoon light. The spring air was warm, carrying the smell of fresh earth and growing things. Clay looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the boy who'd left in grief, but a man who was choosing to come home, choosing to stay. "I should probably mention," Ben said as they walked toward the house, "that I've been thinking about what we could do with this place. Beyond just a historical site." "What do you mean?" "Educational programs, community events, maybe partner with schools, bring kids out to learn about the Underground Railroad, about courage and standing up for what's right. Use the land for something more than just crops." Ben's enthusiasm was building, his hands gesturing as he talked. "We could restore the chamber for tours, but also make the farm a gathering place. Workshops, lectures, living history events. Keep it working land, but land that serves a bigger purpose." Clay felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. "Hope, maybe. Or possibility. That's a big vision." "Yeah," Ben admitted. "Maybe too big. But if we're going to do this, we should do it right. Make it mean something." They reached the porch and sat in the same spots they'd occupied days earlier, when everything had been awkward and painful. Now there was still tension, still wounds that needed healing. But there was also the beginning of something new, something that felt like it might eventually be okay. "Your mother would love this idea," Clay said quietly. "I know," Ben replied. "I've been thinking about her a lot. But what she'd say if she could see what we found. She'd probably have the whole thing organized already, with committees and fundraising plans and a schedule for the next 5 years." Ben laughed, the sound surprising both of them. "Yeah, she would." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the fields, both of them thinking about the woman they'd loved and lost, and about the future they might build in her absence. The newspaper article ran on a Sunday, taking up most of the front page of the Millridge Gazette. The headline read, "Local Farm Reveals Underground Railroad Secret." By Monday morning, the phone hadn't stopped ringing. A reporter from Pittsburgh wanted to do a follow-up story. The State Historical Preservation Office called to schedule a site visit. 2 different documentary filmmakers left messages expressing interest. Clay felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but Ben handled it with surprising grace, taking notes and promising to call people back. Dr. Pemberton arrived Tuesday afternoon with 2 colleagues from the university and a stack of additional documents she'd uncovered. They gathered around the kitchen table, papers spread between coffee cups. "I've been doing more genealogical research," Dr. Pemberton said, her eyes bright with the excitement of discovery. "And I found something remarkable, something I needed to verify before I told you." She pulled out a folder and opened it carefully. "I went back through the Quaker meeting records more thoroughly. There are references to Nathaniel Cross throughout the 1840s and 50s, donations to various causes, attendance at meetings, that sort of thing. But there's also this." She slid a photocopy across the table. It was a letter, the handwriting angular and formal. "To the friends of Millridge meeting, I write to inform you of a matter of conscience that weighs upon my soul. In my youth I loved Ruth Brenner, and our union, though not blessed by formal ceremony, was sincere in the sight of God. When she died bringing forth our son, I made provision for his care but could not claim him openly, as it would have brought shame upon her family and hardship upon the child. Young William knows me as a friend and benefactor, nothing more. Upon my death, I have arranged for the farm and all its holdings to pass to him, that he might have the inheritance a father owes his son. This letter serves as my confession, and my will, that there be no doubt of William's rightful claim to all I possess. Written this 15th day of March, 1863, Nathaniel Cross." Clay stared at the document, his mind racing. "So William was his son. We were right. You were right," Dr. Pemberton confirmed. "But there's more. I found William Cross's marriage record and his children's birth certificates, and I traced the line forward." She pulled out a genealogical chart she'd drawn up. "Clay, Nathaniel Cross is your great-great-great-grandfather. William was your great-great-grandfather. This isn't just a story about your property. This is your direct bloodline." The room fell silent. Clay's hands trembled as he reached for the chart, following the lines of descent. Nathaniel to William, William to James, James to Robert, Robert to Clay's father, and then to Clay himself, and to Ben. "We're his descendants," Ben said quietly. "His actual family." "Yes, and there's something else." Dr. Pemberton pulled out one more document, this one older, more fragile than the others. This was filed with the county clerk in 1855, when Nathaniel first purchased the property. It's a deed restriction, a legal document that places conditions on how the land can be used. Clay took it, reading slowly through the formal legal language. The key passage was near the end. "This land shall be maintained in perpetuity as a station of conscience, a place of refuge for those in need, and a testament to the belief that all souls are equal before God. Should any heir or successor fail to honor this purpose, the property shall pass to the Society of Friends, to be held in trust for humanitarian work. This restriction shall not be removed or altered, binding all future generations who claim ownership." What does that mean exactly?" Ben asked. One of Dr. Pemberton's colleagues, a lawyer who specialized in historical property law, spoke up. It means Nathaniel legally designated this property for humanitarian purposes. In modern terms, this could potentially support establishing the farm as a non-profit organization. The station of conscience language is unusual, but combined with the historical record of what actually happened here, it creates a strong legal framework for preservation and educational use. Clay's mind was spinning. So we couldn't just sell it even if we wanted to? Technically, you could try. But any buyer would take the property subject to this restriction. They'd be legally obligated to use it for humanitarian purposes, or risk having it revert to Quaker oversight. The lawyer smiled slightly. In practical terms, Nathaniel built in protection for his life's work. He wanted to make sure the land continued to serve the purpose he'd devoted himself to. Ben leaned back in his chair, a strange expression on his face. He knew, somehow, he knew that future generations might forget, or might be tempted to use the land for something else. So he made it impossible. He was a man who thought long-term, Dr. Pemberton agreed, and apparently a man who trusted that his descendants would understand and honor what he'd built here. After the visitors left, Clay and Ben walked down to the chamber. They'd been going there most evenings now, drawn by something neither of them could quite name. It felt right to sit in that space, to be close to the history they'd uncovered. Clay held the copy of Nathaniel's letter, reading it again by flashlight. Upon my death, I have arranged for the farm to pass to him, that he might have the inheritance a father owes his son. He loved William, Ben said. He couldn't claim him, couldn't be his father publicly, but he made sure the boy had everything he could give him, and he made sure William would know eventually. This letter, it was meant to be found, meant to explain. They sat quietly for a moment. Then Ben said, "We have to do it, don't we? Turn this place into something more, not just because of the legal restriction, but because it's what Nathaniel intended, what he hoped for." "I think so," Clay agreed, "but it's a big risk. The farm's barely surviving as it is. Trying to turn it into an educational center, a non-profit. We could lose everything. We're losing everything anyway, Dad. At least this way. We're losing it for a reason, for a purpose." Clay thought about that. Thought about the past 3 years of barely holding on, of working himself into exhaustion just to maintain what was. Thought about Ben's misery in Pittsburgh, his own loneliness here on the farm. They'd both been surviving, not living, both been maintaining instead of building. "Nathaniel's last words in the journal," Clay said slowly. "The struggle for human dignity is never finished. Maybe that's what he's asking us to do. Continue the struggle, in whatever form makes sense for our time." "Education," Ben said. "Teaching people about this history, about courage and sacrifice, bringing the community together, making this a place that serves people, not just crops. It would mean completely changing how we operate, probably giving up on most of the farming, dealing with visitors, with programs, with all the things I've spent my life avoiding." "Yeah," Ben admitted. "It would mean change. Big change. Are you ready for that?" Clay looked around the chamber, at the walls that had sheltered so many brave souls, at the children's drawings scratched into stone, at the evidence of his ancestors' quiet courage and stubborn hope. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said honestly, "but I think it's what we're meant to do, what Linda would want us to do, what Nathaniel trusted his family to do. Then let's do it," Ben said. "Let's honor them both. Let's make this place matter again." Clay reached out and gripped his son's shoulder. "Together, together," Ben agreed. Above them, the oak tree's roots pushed through ancient stone, holding firm, holding steady, the way they'd been doing for over a century and a half, waiting for this moment. Attorney Gordon Sheffield's office was in a restored Victorian house on Main Street, the kind of place that felt more like a comfortable library than a law office. Clay and Ben sat across from him while he reviewed the documents they'd brought, copies of Nathaniel's deed restriction, Dr. Pemberton's historical authentication, financial records for the farm, and their preliminary plan for transformation. Sheffield was in his late 50s, with reading glasses perched on his nose and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate complicated situations. He'd been recommended by Dr. Pemberton, who'd worked with him on other historical preservation projects. "This is fascinating," Sheffield said, looking up from the papers. "And legally it's quite solid. The deed restriction gives you a framework that most people spend years trying to establish. Nathaniel Cross essentially pre-approved non-profit status for this property 160 years ago. So we can do it?" Ben asked. "Turn the farm into an educational center." "You can. The question is whether you should, and whether it's financially viable." Sheffield pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. "Here's what you'd need to do. First, establish a formal non-profit organization. I'd recommend a 501c3 charitable foundation. That gives you tax-exempt status and makes you eligible for grants and donations." "How long does that take?" Clay asked. "With the historical documentation you have and the deed restriction, probably 90 days to get preliminary approval. Full certification could take 6 months." Sheffield looked at Clay over his glasses. "You mentioned the farm is behind on mortgage payments." "How far behind?" Clay felt his face flush with embarrassment. 6 months. "The bank sent a foreclosure notice last week." Sheffield's expression remained neutral, professional. "Then we need to move quickly. I'll need to contact the bank, see if we can negotiate a restructuring based on the proposed non-profit status. The historical significance of the property may work in your favor. Banks generally don't want the public relations nightmare of foreclosing on an underground railroad site." "What if they say no?" Ben asked. "Then we explore other options. Emergency grants from historical preservation societies, crowdfunding, or possibly finding a sponsor organization that could take temporary ownership while the non-profit is established." Sheffield set down his pen. "But I won't lie to you, gentlemen. This is going to be challenging. You're asking a financial institution to gamble on a vision that doesn't exist yet." Clay and Ben exchanged glances. "We have to try," Clay said. "I agree, and I think you have a compelling case. Let me make some calls." Sheffield stood, signaling the meeting was coming to a close. "In the meantime, I need you to work with Dr. Pemberton to formalize your educational plan. The bank will want to see concrete details, projected revenue, operational costs, sustainable business model." "Can you have that ready in a week?" "We'll have it ready," Ben promised. The next 7 days were the most intense work Clay had done in years. He and Ben spent every evening at the kitchen table, surrounded by spreadsheets and business plans, trying to turn their vision into something concrete and convincing. Dr. Pemberton came by twice to help, bringing data from similar historical sites around the region. A restored underground railroad station in Ohio was bringing in 40,000 visitors a year. A living history farm in Maryland had successfully partnered with school districts to provide educational programs. The numbers were encouraging, but they also showed how much work would be required. "You'll need staff," Dr. Pemberton said, reviewing their draft budget. "At minimum, a site manager, 2 educators, and someone to handle bookings and visitor relations." "That's 4 salaries," Clay said, feeling overwhelmed. "How do we fund that before we have revenue coming in?" "Grants," she replied. "I've already identified 3 foundations that fund historical education projects. Between them, you could potentially secure enough for your first year of operations. After that, you'd need to be self-sustaining through admission fees, program fees, and continued grant applications." Ben was taking notes furiously. "Oh, what about facilities? The chamber itself is fine, but we'd need restrooms for visitors, maybe a small visitor center, parking area. The State Preservation Office might help with infrastructure if you get landmark status," Dr. Pemberton said. "And there are federal grants for accessibility improvements. It's not impossible, but it requires knowing how to navigate the system. Can you help with that?" Clay asked. She smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask. I'd be honored to serve as your historical director. Part-time, of course. I still have my position at the university." But this project is too important to walk away from. By the end of the week, they had a 30-page business plan that included historical context, educational objectives, financial projections, staffing plans, and a 5-year timeline for development. Ben had even created mock-ups of brochures and a basic website design. "Dad, look at this," Ben said late one night, showing Clay something on his laptop. "I've been researching comparable sites, and almost all of them have community support programs. Volunteer opportunities, youth programs, partnerships with local organizations." Clay studied the screen, seeing Ben's notes and ideas scattered across a digital document. His son had thrown himself into this project with an energy and focus Clay hadn't seen in years. It reminded him of when Ben was young, bringing home school projects and working on them with complete absorption, refusing to quit until they were perfect. "You're good at this," Clay said quietly. "The planning, the big picture thinking. You get that from your mother." Ben looked up, surprised. "You think so?" "I know so." She could see possibilities where other people just saw problems. "She'd have loved what you're doing here." Ben's eyes grew bright, and he looked away quickly. "I keep thinking about her, wishing I could show her all this. She spent so much time researching local history, and here we are, sitting on maybe the most important historical site in the county, and she never got to know about it." "She knows," Clay said. "Somehow I think she knows." They worked in comfortable silence for a while longer. Then Ben spoke again. "Dad, what happens if the bank says no? If we lose the farm anyway?" Clay had been trying not to think about that possibility. "I don't know, son. I honestly don't know. Because I want you to know. Even if we lose this place, I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure something out. Together." Clay felt his throat tighten. "That means more than you know." The day of the bank meeting arrived too quickly and not quickly enough. Clay barely slept the night before, running through their presentation in his mind, imagining every possible question and objection. Ben was calmer, or at least better at hiding his nerves. They dressed carefully, not suits, which would have felt false, but clean work shirts and decent pants. They were farmers, not businessmen, and there was no point pretending otherwise. They loaded their presentation materials into Ben's truck, the business plan, letters of support from Dr. Pemberton and the Historical Society, photographs of the chamber and artifacts, and the deed restriction that proved this land was meant for something more than profit. Sheriff Paulson stopped by just as they were leaving. "Heard you've got a big meeting today. Wanted to wish you luck." "Thanks," Clay said. "We'll need it. For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is important. This town needs something to be proud of, something that brings people together, instead of just watching them leave." Paulson extended his hand. "You've got more support than you probably realize." The drive to the bank felt both too short and endless. Clay's hands were sweating on the steering wheel. Beside him, Ben sat quietly, flipping through their notes one more time. "Whatever happens," Clay said as they pulled into the parking lot, "I'm proud of you. Of us. We did something here. We found each other again." Ben looked at his father and smiled. "Yeah, we did. Now let's go save the farm." The bank's conference room was all polished wood and fluorescent lighting designed to intimidate. 5 people sat on the opposite side of the table. Mr. Stanley Voss, the bank president, and 4 board members whose names Clay immediately forgot. They looked like they belonged there, comfortable in their business attire, while Clay felt like he'd tracked mud across a clean floor. Voss was a thin man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of person who probably analyzed risk assessments for entertainment. He gestured for Clay and Ben to sit, his expression giving nothing away. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I understand you have a proposal regarding the Whitman property." Clay's mouth was dry. He started to speak, but his voice came out rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Yes, sir. We'd like to request a loan restructuring based on new information about the property's historical significance." "I've read Mr. Sheffield's initial brief," Voss said. "Underground railroad station, family connection to the original conductor. Quite the discovery." Clay couldn't tell if that was meant to be encouraging or dismissive. He pulled out the presentation binder they'd prepared, passing copies to each board member. Ben had organized it beautifully, photographs of the chamber, transcribed journal entries, Dr. Pemberton's authentication letter, and the business plan. The property has been verified by the State Historical Society as an authentic and remarkably well-preserved Underground Railroad station. Clay began, his voice steadier now. Our ancestor Nathaniel Cross helped 247 people escape slavery between 1858 and 1863. The chamber beneath the oak tree, the journal, the artifacts, they're all documented here. He walked them through the discovery, explaining how the chamber had remained sealed for over a century and a half. He showed them photographs of the journal entries, the quilt with its coded patterns, the ledger of names. One of the board members, a woman in her 40s, leaned forward to study the images more closely. "This is remarkable," she said quietly. "I had no idea anything like this existed in our area." "Neither did we," Clay admitted. "But now that we know, we have a responsibility to preserve it, to share it." Ben took over, presenting the transformation plan. He explained their vision clearly and confidently. Educational programs for schools, guided tours, community events, partnerships with universities. He walked them through the financial projections, showing comparable sites and their success rates. "We've identified 3 major grant opportunities that would fund our first year of operations," Ben said. "After that, we project sustainability through a combination of admission fees, program fees, and ongoing grant applications. Dr. Pemberton from the State Historical Society has agreed to serve as our historical director." Voss listened without expression, occasionally making notes. When Ben finished, he folded his hands on the table. "These are impressive plans, but plans don't pay mortgages. You're 6 months behind on payments, Mr. Whitman. The bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings." Clay felt his heart sink, but he pressed on. "I understand that. But the property has value beyond its market price. This is a significant historical site. The deed restriction from 1855 designates it for humanitarian purposes in perpetuity. Any buyer would take it subject to those restrictions, which makes it harder to sell, not easier," Voss pointed out. "Or it makes it more valuable to the right buyer," Ben countered. "A historical society, an educational foundation, a museum, organizations that would want it specifically because of those restrictions." Another board member, an older man with kind eyes, spoke up. "Mr. Voss, I think we need to consider the public relations angle here. If we foreclose on an underground railroad site, especially one with this level of historical significance, it won't reflect well on the bank. We're not in the business of making decisions based on sentiment," Voss replied. "We have fiduciary responsibilities." "I'm not talking about sentiment," the man said. "I'm talking about community standing and long-term relationships. The Whitman family has banked here for 5 generations." Clay seized the opening. "Sir, I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance. Restructure the loan with lower payments over a longer term, tied to our non-profit status. Give us 90 days to finalize the non-profit paperwork and secure initial grant funding. If we can't meet those benchmarks, you can proceed with foreclosure." Voss studied him for a long moment. "You're asking us to gamble on history and hope, Mr. Whitman." "No, sir," Clay said, and he was surprised by the strength in his own voice. "I'm asking you to invest in community and purpose. This farm has been saving lives for over 160 years. It saved mine. It saved my sons. We're not asking you to bet against us. We're asking you to bet with us." The room fell silent. Clay could hear his own heartbeat, feel Ben's tension beside him. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd discovered and planned and hoped, it all came down to this moment. Voss glanced at his fellow board members. "We need to deliberate privately. If you'll wait outside, please." Clay and Ben gathered their materials and left the conference room. The hallway felt too bright, too exposed. They sat in uncomfortable chairs near the elevator, not speaking. Ben's leg bounced with nervous energy. Clay's hands were clasped so tightly, his knuckles were white. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Clay kept checking his watch, though he knew it wouldn't make the time move faster. "Dad," Ben said quietly, Whatever happens, we tried. We did everything we could. I know. And we're okay, you and me. That's what matters most. Clay looked at his son and felt a rush of gratitude and love, so intense it nearly took his breath away. Yeah, he managed. We are. The conference room door opened. Voss stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Gentlemen, if you'll come back in. They returned to their seats. Clay's heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. Voss sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked at them both. The board has reached a decision. Voss opened the folder in front of him, and Clay braced himself for disappointment. He'd seen that look before, the careful, professional expression of someone about to deliver bad news. We've reviewed your proposal thoroughly, Voss began. The historical significance of the property is undeniable. The business plan, while ambitious, shows genuine research and realistic projections. Dr. Pemberton's involvement lends credibility to the educational component. Clay's fingernails dug into his palms. Just tell us, he thought. However, Voss continued, and Clay's heart sank. The bank has fiduciary responsibilities. We cannot make decisions based solely on emotional considerations or historical interest. We must evaluate financial viability and risk. Ben's hand found Clay's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Voss looked at them both, and something shifted in his expression, something almost human beneath the professional veneer. That said, we also recognize that some investments aren't just about the safest return. Sometimes they're about doing what's necessary for the community we serve. Clay's breath caught. The board has voted to approve a conditional loan restructuring, Voss said. We will extend your loan term, reduce your monthly payments, and suspend foreclosure proceedings. However, there are specific conditions that must be met. Clay couldn't speak. Ben's grip on his shoulder tightened. First, you must complete non-profit status certification within 90 days. Second, you must secure at least one major grant within 6 months, minimum $50,000. Third, you and your son must both be listed as co-directors and primary operators of the property. And fourth, you'll be subject to quarterly reviews to ensure you're meeting operational benchmarks. We can do that, Ben said immediately. All of it. Voss held up a hand. Understand this is not a gift. If you fail to meet any of these conditions, foreclosure proceedings will resume. The bank is taking a significant risk here. We understand, Clay said, finding his voice at last. And we won't let you down. Voss nodded, then did something unexpected. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, suddenly looking less like a banker and more like a tired man carrying old memories. My great-grandfather was helped by the Underground Railroad. Somewhere in Ohio, I think, though the family records are vague. He made it to Canada, worked for years saving money, and eventually came back to buy land here in Pennsylvania. Built a life, raised a family. He looked directly at Clay. I never knew where he was sheltered, who helped him, who risked everything to give him that chance. When I read your proposal, saw the names in that ledger, I kept thinking, maybe someone's ancestor wrote my great-grandfather's name in a book like that. Maybe someone's family is sitting here today because of what your ancestor did. The room was absolutely silent. So yes, this is a financial risk, Voss continued, his voice rough with emotion. But sometimes the right investment isn't the safest one. Sometimes it's the necessary one. He extended his hand across the table. Good luck, Mr. Whitman. Make it work. Clay shook his hand, then Ben did the same. The other board members offered congratulations and handshakes, suddenly warmer now that the decision was made. The woman who'd been studying the photographs promised to volunteer once programs started. The kind-eyed man mentioned his granddaughter's school might be interested in field trips. They signed preliminary paperwork, received copies of the restructuring terms, and scheduled a follow-up meeting. It all felt surreal, like Clay was watching it happen to someone else. Outside, in the bright sunshine of the parking lot, Ben let out a whoop of joy that startled a passing businessman. He grabbed Clay in a fierce hug, lifting him slightly off the ground despite Clay's protests. We did it, Ben said, laughing. Dad, we actually did it. Clay hugged his son back, feeling tears on his face and not caring. We did. They drove home in a daze of relief and excitement, already making plans. Ben called Attorney Sheffield with the news. Clay called Dr. Pemberton, who shrieked with delight so loudly he had to hold the phone away from his ear. By the time they pulled up to the farmhouse, word was already spreading through Milridge's small network of interested parties. They walked down to the chamber together, needing to be in that space, to tell Nathaniel somehow that his trust hadn't been misplaced. Clay stood in the center of the room, looking at the walls that had witnessed so much courage. "We have to decide about the gold," Ben said. "We need some of it to get the operation started, but the rest should go to the causes Nathaniel would have wanted." "Half and half," Clay agreed. "Half to establish the foundation, half donated to organizations helping refugees and displaced families. Modern-day freedom seekers. He'd approve of that." They climbed back up into the fading afternoon light. The oak tree stood massive and solid above them, its roots still pushing through ancient stone, still holding firm after all these years. "I need to visit your mother's grave," Clay said. "Tell her what we're doing. Will you come with me?" Ben nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." They drove to the small cemetery outside town and stood together at Linda's headstone. Clay told her about the discovery, about Ben coming home, about the plan to transform the farm. He told her they were going to be okay, that they'd found their way back to each other. Ben knelt and placed his hand on the stone. "We're going to make something good, Mom, something that would make you proud." As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, father and son stood side by side, no longer separated by grief, but united by purpose and hope. 3 months had changed everything. Clay stood at the chamber entrance on a crisp October morning, watching as workers installed the memorial plaque they'd commissioned. Brass, with letters deeply engraved so they'd last another century or more. Ben supervised the placement, making sure it was level, making sure it was right. The inscription read, "In memory of Nathaniel Cross and all who sought freedom here. May this place forever stand for courage, hope, and human dignity." The farmhouse was different now, too. Ben's old room was occupied again, his belongings unpacked, his presence filling spaces that had been empty too long. They'd established a morning routine, coffee together before the day's work began, easy conversation about plans and problems, the comfortable rhythm of 2 people learning to live and work side by side. The non-profit paperwork had been approved 2 weeks earlier. Cross Farm Heritage Center, officially recognized as a 501c3 charitable foundation. Dr. Pemberton served as historical director, and they'd hired 2 part-time educators from the community college. A retired teacher named Mrs. Judith Crane volunteered 3 days a week, bringing homemade cookies and endless energy. The first grant had come through, $75,000 from the State Historical Preservation Fund. More applications were pending. A documentary crew had spent a week filming, and their piece would air on the state PBS station next month. School districts from 3 counties had already booked field trips for the spring. Today was the soft opening, a small ceremony for supporters and community members before they opened to the public next week. Folding chairs were set up near the oak tree, maybe 50 of them. Not a huge crowd, but the right people, those who'd believed in the vision from the beginning. Sheriff Paulson arrived early, helping arrange the chairs. Dr. Pemberton came with her university colleagues, all of them eager to see the finished restoration. Attorney Sheffield brought his wife. Neighbors Clay hadn't spoken to in years showed up, curious and supportive. Mrs. Crane arrived with her daughter, who pushed her wheelchair carefully over the uneven ground. Judith was 87, her hands twisted with arthritis, but her mind was sharp as ever. She'd become one of their most valuable volunteers, sharing stories her grandmother had told her about the Underground Railroad, about the courage it took to run, and the courage it took to help. As people gathered, Ben pulled Clay aside. "You ready for this?" "I think so. You wrote a good speech." "We wrote it together." Ben adjusted his father's collar, a gesture so reminiscent of Linda that Clay felt his throat tighten. "She'd be proud of us, you know, what we've built here." "I know she would." The ceremony began simply. Dr. Pemberton spoke about the historical significance of the site, the remarkable preservation of the chamber and artifacts. She read excerpts from Nathaniel's journal, her voice catching on the passage about children drawing pictures while waiting for freedom. Then it was Clay's turn. He stood before the small gathering, these people who'd supported him and Ben through the hardest months, and spoke from the heart. 3 months ago, I was about to lose everything. This farm, this land that's been in my family for 5 generations, I thought it was slipping away. And in some ways, I'd already lost what mattered most. My wife was gone. My son was gone. I was just going through the motions, maintaining something that didn't really mean anything anymore. He paused, looking at Ben, who stood off to the side with an encouraging nod. Then I found a hidden chamber beneath that oak tree, and everything changed. I discovered that this land means more than I ever knew, that my family's story is part of something bigger, something that mattered then and matters now. But more than that, I found a way back to my son, a reason to stop just surviving and start actually living again. He gestured toward the memorial plaque, now gleaming in the morning sun. Nathaniel Cross wrote that the struggle for human dignity is never finished. He understood that every generation has to take up that work in whatever form makes sense for their time. For him, it was hiding people in the darkness, giving them food and shelter and hope. For us, it's education. It's bringing people together. It's teaching the next generation about courage and sacrifice and doing what's right even when it's hard. His voice grew stronger. Your mother always said the best crops grow from broken ground. It took me too long to understand what she meant. But I understand it now. Sometimes we have to break apart before we can grow into something new. This land has been broken and made whole so many times. By ice that split the stone, by roots that pushed through rock, by people who risked everything for freedom. And now by 2 men who almost lost each other but found their way back. Clay looked out at the faces before him, people who'd become part of this journey. Thank you for believing in us. Thank you for helping us turn a broken farm into something that serves our community, that honors the past while looking toward the future. We promise to be good stewards of this history and this legacy. The applause was warm and genuine. People stood, some wiping their eyes. Mrs. Crane raised a shaking hand and called out, "My grandmother's name was Esther Crawford." She was one of the people Nathaniel helped. Her name is in that ledger. A hush fell over the gathering. Dr. Pemberton immediately pulled out her phone, accessing the digital copy of the ledger they'd created. "Here it is," she said softly. August 1860, Esther Crawford, age 19. Safe passage granted, Judith's eyes filled with tears. I never knew where she'd been hidden. Never knew who helped her. She made it to Canada, married, had children. Came back south after the war ended. She lived to be 93 years old and told stories about the people who helped her, though she never knew their names. She looked at Clay with profound emotion. She always said to honor those who help others, to pass on the kindness we receive. That's what you're doing here. Ben helped Judith from her wheelchair to stand beside the memorial plaque. Her daughter supported her as she placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base. "For my grandmother," she said, "and for Nathaniel Cross, and for all the brave souls who passed through here." The ceremony ended with a tour of the chamber, small groups descending the stone steps to see the space where history had unfolded. Clay stood at the entrance, greeting each person, answering questions, feeling the weight and wonder of what they'd created. As the sun climbed higher and the last visitors departed, Clay and Ben found themselves alone by the oak tree. The memorial plaque caught the light, a permanent marker of what had been and what would continue to be. "We did it," Ben said quietly. "We did," Clay agreed. Together, they stood in comfortable silence, father and son, beside the tree that had witnessed so much and held so many secrets. Above them, branches reached toward the sky. Below them, roots gripped stone. And around them, the land that had been passed down through generations waited to serve a new purpose, to teach new lessons, to continue the work that was never finished. Clay touched the rough bark of the oak, feeling the connection to everyone who'd come before. Nathaniel, William, all the freedom seekers who'd sheltered here, Linda, who'd loved this place. They were all part of the same story, the same legacy. "Ready to go home?" Ben asked. Glay smiled. "Yeah, let's go home." They walked back toward the farmhouse, lights glowing warm in the windows, welcoming them. Behind them, the chamber waited, ready to share its stories with all who would come to listen. And the oak tree stood witness, as it had for 2 centuries, roots deep and branches reaching, a testament to persistence, to hope, to life, finding a way even in the hardest circumstances. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in the ground, but in the people standing beside us when we uncover them.